Video. Hello. If you are watching this video, this is Bruce Hammer, and I am putting together a quick video for you all to go through some of the aspects of the new NAR settlement um, and the new forms that are going to be released to help with your buyer representation. So a couple things up front. This thing is very fluid. Uh, right now, um, right now, the forms that are going to be rolled out in the June release um, are changing on a daily basis. Sometimes a couple times throughout the day they are changing. I know this because I have a link from Rebs, which is the company that produces these forms for CAR and zip forms, and I can see the dates and times that they're changing these things as they go. Funny fact, yesterday I recorded this video for roughly an hour and a half. And at the end of it, I realized that I had not set Zoom to actually record. Stupid me. Anyway, the right after I finished and realized that I hadn't recorded it, I checked my link and they had actually removed one form that they were planning on rolling out and they added in another form. That was just in the time, between, yesterday and a few hours into the morning. So what I'm trying to get across to you guys is these forms are what we have as of this writing or as of this filming. And between today, April 26, 2024 at 9:34 in the morning, and when these things are released sometime in June, there may be many other changes or some more additions. But this is the best information we have as of right now, and I wanted to get it out to you so you can start preparing yourselves for what's going to be our new world in real estate. And many aspects of it, I think, are going to be a benefit to y'all. Um, so, couple quick notes on the actual NAR settlement. Last Saturday, I believe it was, the judge in Missouri actually gave preliminary approval to the settlement. Now it's got to go through some other hoops, and they anticipate final approval will probably happen in November of 2024. However, most of the people involved, most of the MLSs and associations and stuff will begin implementation mid-July. Some of you are starting to implement it early. That's fine. There's no harm in that. Do you need to? No, it's not required that you implement buyer broker agreements prior to when the MLS finally removes the commission field from MLS listings and starts prohibiting offers of compensation to the buyer broker in the MLS. And that's basically what's going to happen. There's a couple things that are required with this settlement. One is you must have a buyer broker agreement. The form that's going to be used is called the BRBC, Buyer Representation and Compensation Agreement, right? That's number one. Number two, um, sellers and listing agents cannot reference an offer of compensation in the MLS, period. That field is going to be taken away. It's not going to be a matter of putting zero in the field. There's just not going to be a field. Um, Three, um, sellers and listing agent, or actually sellers, they will be permitted to put that they will pay some sort of a um, help in to the buyer, whether it's closing cost or buyer concessions. They will be able to reference that in the MLS. It's unclear at this point as to whether that's going to happen in a specific field or if they're going to be able to put it in confidential remarks. But buyer concessions of some type, that wording will be able to be placed in the MLS. Um, um, and you can take that as kind of your hint that the seller or the agent is willing to somehow compensate the buyer's agent for the buyer's obligation as referenced in the buyer's representation agreement. Um, the other thing that will be allowed is you listing agents out there, you will be able to reference an offer of compensation on your own personal websites, in your flyers, or anything like that. It just cannot be placed in an MLS or in any website controlled by that MLS or affiliated with the MLS. All right. So that's kind of the general landscape that we have right now. In order to make this happen, CAR and ZIP forms have added in or modified a bunch of existing forms, or they've added in new forms. And we're going to go through kind of that those forms in a second. But first, I wanted to give you kind of a roadmap to help you along. And the stuff that we're going to be going through today will be placed. Um, you'll be able to access it through a link. It'll be on our share drive, and you'll be able to download these props, what you're looking at now, and some of these forms, at your convenience. But I wanted to kind of cover this stuff with you here. um, so first of all, kind of the workflow if you're working with a buyer. You're going to have some sort of an intake meeting or appointment with the buyer where you're going to fill out some forms. These are the forms you're going to fill out. But the other part to this is you're going to have that meeting with them where you are going to have to sell yourself. You're going to have to show them the value that you bring to the table in their using you to help them find a home. What is it that makes you stand out? What are the services you offer? How can you benefit them? In addition to that, these are the forms that you'll need to consider going through. Number one is the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. Number two is the buyer transactional advisory. Now, I will tell you this particular form, it's unclear as of this moment whether CAR will keep including this in the BRBC package. But as of right now, it is there. The broker compensation advisory, the BCA, the BIPP, which is the buyer identification of preferences and properties, along with the BFPI, which is the buyer financial and personal info. These two forms are new. And my first impression of them is I think they're great and they will be able to help you a lot. And they'll be able to help your buyer try to identify exactly what they're looking for, along with their qualifications to buy. Last thing you want to be doing in this, new real estate environment is spinning your wheels for a buyer that can't figure out what they want or can't express to you what they're looking for. And two, a buyer that's not qualified to purchase. The combination of these two forms will solve those problems, in my belief. And then the ABCD, anticipated broker compensation disclosure. So these are ones you'll be including as part of your initial forms that you'll need to fill out as part of your buyer intake meeting. Optional forms. There is a DM-BR, Disclosure and Modification to Buyer Representation Agreement. This form is going to have a very limited purpose. If you have signed a buyer representation and broker compensation agreement with a client prior to the new forms release in June of 2024, then you're going to want to use this form. And because there's certain things applicable to the settlement that now have to be disclosed to the buyer. And that's the form to do it with. And then we also have another optional form, the MT-BR. So the modification of terms form, the MT, that's being skedaddled. It's no longer going to be available to you. And instead, we're going to have an MT-BR for buyers. There's also going to be a separate one for sellers. And those will be the new forms that you can use. But this MT-buyer representation agreement modification of terms buyer representation agreement is only used to modify or change a current BRBC. So if you enter into a buyer representation agreement after the new forms are released in June, and then you need to modify some terms, this is the form that you would use. They are also coming out with, I'm calling it a generic compensation agreement. It's only to be used when there is no other signed listing, buyer representation, or single party compensation agreement. And this is called the CA compensation agreement. So that's that. Once you get your forms filled out, and keep in mind, you have to have a buyer representation agreement filled out in order to, yeah, that has to be done prior to taking your buyer out to look at properties or prior to arranging for them to see properties. Once you've done that and you've identified some properties, my recommendation is you reach out to the listing agent and just ask them flat out, unless they have something in the MLS that kind of cues you in that their seller is willing to pay some buyer concessions. If you see that term buyer concessions in the MLS, that's a big hint, should be a big clue to you that, yeah, the seller's probably open to that. So then you pick up the phone, you call the listing agent, and you ask them flat out. If they give you an indication, that's great. Then there's a form for that. If the agent says, well, the seller's not, but I'm willing to pay, X% to the buyer's agent, then you would deal with that through a CBC form. And we'll go over that too. Once you get that information, and again, I just recommend picking up the phone and asking if you can't see anything in the MLS. You prepare your offer. With your offer, you're going to include a CBC. Well, actually, prior to sending your offer, you're going to fill out a CBC if the agent has stated or has given you some indication that the agent is willing to pay your buyer broker fee. Or if the agent has indicated or you've seen something in the MLS that would clue you or key you that the seller is willing to pay your buyer broker's fee, you're going to want to use this form SPBB, which attaches to your RPA. SPBB is the seller payment to buyer's broker. And this form actually becomes part of the contract. So if the seller ratifies, signs your contract that you send over, they must also sign the SPPB, or it is not a fully ratified contract if that form is included. But if they sign that, the seller is agreeing to pay the commission, to pay your buyer broker commission as whatever it's listed, whatever you list in the SPBB. So again, when you do your RPA, if the agent has said the agent is going to pay it, you would include a CBC. You're going to send the CBC. I recommend sending it ahead of time. Get that signed, then send your offer. If the listing agent has said or has indicated in the MLS that the seller is willing to pay buyer concessions, something like that, and then you talk to them and they say, oh yeah, the seller will pay buyer's commission, you're going to include the SPBB in the contract with the contract package. And the second thing I want to add here is if the listing agent tells you that the seller is not willing to pay a commission, I would say there is no harm in sending over an offer and sending it with the SPBB anyway. Listing agent has to present it to the seller. If the seller hasn't gotten any other better offers on the table, yours is the only game in town, the seller might reconsider and agree to pay that buyer's agent's commission. And then the last form that I want to bring to your attention in this package here is the COBR, and that's the cancellation of buyer representation. I want to remind you at this point, if you don't have a broker compensation agreement, that means that you will not be able to get paid at the close of escrow. So this isn't a, well, people tell me I should have this, or, it'd be helpful if I have it. No, you must have this if you're representing a buyer in a transaction and you expect to get paid. All right. So moving on through here, the first document we're going to go over is the BRBC, the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. All right. So you're going to notice right off the bat, if you've looked at the one that's currently available in zip forms, it looks nothing like this. They've done a complete redesign. They've taken on the look that you see when you look at the RPA with that grid on the front pages. Um, I really like what they've done for this form. It's much less confusing. Right off the bat, A1 covers the period, beginning and ending, type of representation, whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive. The default on this form is exclusive. So if you don't check this box, the default is non-exclusive. This is a non-exclusive representation agreement. The difference is if you make it exclusive, the broker is entitled to compensation if the buyer buys any property during the term of the agreement with or without your involvement. Even if it's another broker that found it for him that's entitled to compensation, if you have an exclusive agreement, you are also entitled to compensation. Now, my feeling is most buyers are probably going to be not thrilled with you checking that box, but I would try to check that box anyway. I would check it up front, and if they object to it, then you can always modify it. It's just more protection for you. You have a section here where you can also identify the types of properties that they're looking for, the location, any additional factors that they want to put in. The form itself has a spot to list 2 specific properties. If you need to list more, if you've already identified them anyway, you can check this box and attach a sheet. There's also another form that you can use to track the properties that you've actually gone out to look at, which we will also go over. Let's just say, for example, the buyer has already been working with an agent, they tired of that agent for whatever reason, they come to you and they say, yeah, I'd like you to take us out and show us some properties, but they mentioned to you that they've worked with this other agent and he has shown them, whatever properties. They had an agreement with him, he showed them whatever properties. You might exclude those properties by listing them here. That way your client doesn't get into a situation where if they come back later and say, yeah, we want to buy one of these properties, the right thing to do would be to send them back to that agent so there's not a conflict where you have multiple agents trying to get paid from this buyer, which I do anticipate is going to be an issue, and we're going to have to work through that. I can envision cases where you have buyers that have been through multiple agents, all of whom have exclusive BRBCs signed, and we're going to have to figure out a system, or our association or CAR is going to have to figure out a system for how we work through those disputes. Remember, this is all kind of new to our industry here because not a lot of agents, not the majority of agents have been using buyer broker agreements in the past. Now it's going to be mandatory. Amount of compensation. So section D is where you discuss your compensation. Right off the bat, you can put it as a certain percentage of the sales price or a flat fee. Payments from third parties. I put a note here. You may not be paid more than the amount referenced in your BRBC. So how does that play out? If you were to put, and I'm just going to use a random number here, I'm not saying you should always use this percentage, or we have a fixed rate because commissions are negotiable. But let's just say you put 2% in here as the amount that the buyer is responsible for paying you unless there is money received from someone else, the seller, the listing agent, etc. You put 2% right here. And then you show a property and the listing agent says, oh yeah, the seller is willing to pay 2.5%. What this means is the most that you are entitled to receive in compensation is not 2.5%. You are only allowed to receive the amount up to the amount referenced here. Now, let's just say you talk with your buyer and the buyer says, well, the seller is willing to pay 2.5%. How about you charge the 2.5% and then credit one half of 1% over to me to use for closing costs? You can't do that either. Um, you cannot be paid more than the amount in your buyer broker agreement, and any excess that the seller is willing to pay cannot pass through you. There's a way to make that work. That there can be a way of doing that, but the way it has to happen would be through a contract provision that you fill out the appropriate documents where the seller will be paying your portion of the buyer broker, or your amount due under the buyer broker for 2%. And then you have a separate contract provision where the seller is agreeing to pay one half of 1% of the sales price to the buyer to use as recurring and non-recurring closing costs or something like that. That's how you could make it work. Hopefully that's clear. Cancellation notice. There's a separate form for canceling. If the buyer broker is a non-exclusive buyer broker, then the cancellation is effective upon receipt, or you can put in here in advance however many days after receipt. If it's exclusive, it must be effective 30 days after receipt. Right? And then as you can see, it's going to attach this BCA form. This is the section where it includes all of the explanations about all these terms in the grid. Now, this is a relatively new form. Most of you have not used them before, and I am highly recommending when these forms come out that you take a few minutes and go through and look at these forms, maybe even practice filling one out ahead of time. Um, you know, if you're working with buyers, you are now going to have to, as part of your presentation, show the value that you bring to the table. And what you don't want is to show confusion over how to fill out a form, which would take away from you showing how valuable you are to your client. So take a few minutes to learn, digest these terms, and attempt to understand what these new forms are doing and how they might impact you and your client ahead of time. That way, it's kind of like when you learn a new script. You need to internalize that script so it sounds natural when you're saying it, and it doesn't sound like you're reading off of a form. Same way with these forms. You need to be comfortable enough with filling them out and with answering buyers' questions about them so that you sound competent. No one wants to work with somebody that doesn't sound competent. All right. Let's see here. Talks about financial and personal information. As I said, there's actually a form now that you can fill out in your intake with the buyer where they're going to detail all of that stuff. And then on the very last page here, page 4 of 4, paragraph 15, this is where you're going to reiterate the amount of the buyer compensation. And you might ask yourself, why do they put this again on the last page? Well, the reason is simple. If a third party is going to be paying your buyer broker compensation to you, this page can be turned over, just this page. It has buyers and broker's signature on it, and it has the amount of compensation laid out. This page can be turned over to a seller. It can be turned over to Listing agent, it can be turned over to the title company for when they're doing their commission demands and things like that. So just this page, you don't have to turn over the whole form, but that's what this is for. The next form, buyer transactional advisory. I made a note here, this form, assuming it is not removed from the CIR forms and that we are unsure as of April 26th at 9:57 whether that's going to happen or not, but that may be added to your BRBC presentation. I love the form itself, talks about agent duties and limitations, buyer obligations, the scope of agent's duties. And this last paragraph, I think is important too. Buyer representation agreement allows for dual agency. The BRBC permits the broker to act as dual agent for both buyer and seller in the transaction. Under California law, even though one individual real estate agent may be the only licensee in direct contact with the buyer on a property transaction, and another individual agent may be the only licensee in direct contact with the seller for that same transaction. Since both agents work for the same brokerage firm, the brokerage firm and its agents are all dual agents. Now, we all knew that. It's also legally permissible for one agent to be in direct contact with both the buyer and seller, in which case dual agency will also be established for both the brokerage and the agent in the transaction. If the buyer does not want to allow dual agency, then the buyer should discuss with the broker the implications of such a request and then come to an agreement with the broker. Nice disclosure there. I love that. Let's see here. Broker Compensation Advisory, the BCA. This form explains how you can get paid in the transaction. Section 1 discusses the seller side of the transaction and payments to the listing broker and possibility of payments to buyer's broker. Section 2 and 3 discuss requirements for buyer broker agreements as well as methods for buyer brokers to be paid. This form can be used or will be used with both listings and with buyers. And you can see here it's set up for either to sign on the bottom. And it has a nice little, I love paragraph 3. It talks about all the different ways that a buyer's broker can obtain compensation. Buyer pays the compensation through a buyer representation agreement. Seller pays the compensation. Buyer negotiates for seller to pay the buyer's obligation under the BRBC. Or the buyer's agent negotiates an agreement directly with the seller. And then lastly, the seller's agent pays compensation to the buyer's agent through a CBC. All right. Next form, BIPP, buyer identification of preferences and priorities. And this goes hand in hand with the form that will come after this, which goes through their financial qualifications. But this form I love. Although the BRBC sets minimum requirements to show the broker's right to be compensated, this form helps the buyer's agent know what is important to the buyer, such as price, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, area, etc. And important fact, information that they list here is considered confidential. You cannot disclose it to a seller or the listing agent. So you can see here, though, you can slice and dice all the nice little preferences, including areas, cities, counties, etc., what the buyer's choices are. We've got a confidentiality provision here. Regardless of agency relationship, in any transaction involving buyer and broker, these preferences and priorities will not be disclosed to any seller or the seller's agent except with the buyer's permission. That's this form. The next one is the other one I was talking about, buyer financial and personal information. This form here, basically it's how much of a down payment can you put down, what kind of deposit do you have, the source of your down payment, is it a retirement account, a gift, a loan, some assistance program, whatever. If you're in maximum loan amount, if you're involved with a lender already, who are they? What's their contact information? Do you have are you pre-qualified, pre-approved? Blah, blah, blah. What kind of loan are you getting? Um, there's a note here, if FHA or VA financing is pursued, lender may not allow buyer to pay certain closing costs, including broker compensation. Buyer's broker compensation should be paid by the seller or the seller's broker. It even has sections in here so that you can find out, so that you can include it in the contract as a formal notice to um, the seller and the listing agent that the buyer is actually a licensee, or whatever else, contractor, tradesperson, etc. The only one that I know of that's legally required is if they are a real estate salesperson or broker. Um, time constraints, are they relocating, whatever. I think this form is really going to be helpful to use in your initial buyer consult. So anyway, moving on, we have the ABCD, anticipated broker compensation disclosure. Um, let's see here. This one here, the top section of the form is the only one that you actually need to fill out and have the buyer sign and you sign. But what this form is useful for is if you identify a bunch of properties you're going to be looking at, or you can put them on here as you look at them. The agents will initial, the buyers will initial, you'll have the property information here. You indicate the date that you first showed the property, the compensation being offered if you know it, and the source of that information. Did you talk to the seller's broker? Did you talk to the seller? Whatever. This form can be helpful for tracking what you've done with the buyer, but also that buyer ends up buying a property that's on this list that you've just shown them through another agent. This will help your um, case if you try to pursue a procuring cause type of ethics issue, or if you try to pursue a case as entitled to under your buyer broker agreement against that buyer. So moving on, we have the DM-BR disclosure and modification of buyer representation agreement. You'll recall this is the one that you would use if you entered into a BRBC prior to June 2024 when the new forms come out. This form lets the buyer know that the broker can no longer accept compensation that exceeds the amount specified in the BRBC that they sign with you, and that's due to the NAR proposed settlement. It also explains what will happen if the BRBC contained a term allowing excess compensation to be turned over to the buyer, because that can't happen anymore. So that's what this form is for. And that section where it explains that we can no longer turn those excess funds, I've underlined that down here for your attention. And then we have the modification of terms buyer representation agreement. Recall that this form is replacing the CAR form called a modification of terms, or MT. There will be a separate one for the buyer side, separate one for the listing side. This is the one for the buyer side, obviously. This should be used to document a change in the buyer representation agreement that occurs after the new form comes out. Pre-printed language allows for changes of expiration date. New printed language allows for compensation to be changed. And this form replaces the form MT. You can see here, you can change the expiration date, extend it out. You can change the compensation. There's a kind of a catch-all here where you can put other factoids in that need to be considered. And it's simple form, just signed by buyer and broker, or you, not the actual broker itself, but you. And then we get to the residential purchase agreement. There have been some changes made to the RPA that will be coming out in June. One of them relates to the buyer broker agreement. A couple others are off topic, but still important for you, and I thought I'd point them out here. Um, no major changes to the format or appearance of the new form. There is section G3 here. Seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under separate agreement. And that's using a form SPBB. You'll recall my earlier mention. If the agent tells you that the seller is willing to pay the buyer a commission, or if the seller has had the listing agent indicate something about the seller is willing to pay buyer concessions or something like that in the MLS, then you would want to use this form. If the seller tells you that the buyer is not willing to pay any commission, and by the way, I'm not willing to pay any commission either, but the buyer still wants to submit an offer on it, in my view, check this box, include an SPBB, naming the amount of commission that you have in your buyer broker agreement, and submit. And by doing so, this form SPBB becomes a part of the RPA that you're submitting. And basically, it'll be up to the seller to look, the listing agent will have to present it, and the seller is going to have to make a determination if they're going to reject it or counter it. But at least this way, you're not just taking the listing agent's word for the fact that the seller's not going to pay, because the seller may change their mind if they haven't gotten any other offers, or maybe the listing agent was just posturing, trying to get the seller the best deal out of it. Who knows? But include this form in that scenario. So that's G3. And again, if you check this box, it's going to add this SPBB form to your contract package in zip forms. All right. This is new. You notice under the contingencies section L, they have added a new contingency for insurance. Basically, the buyer has to be able to obtain insurance at a price that they deem affordable. And if they can't do so within whatever number of days are in here, the buyer can use that inability to get insurance at a price they deem it affordable as a reason for backing out of the contract. This has become necessary because of all the problems we've had with the insurance industry in California. So this is the solution for that. And I think it's a great idea, and I think it'll be helpful. Moving on, let's see here. This is the explanation for that. As you can see, it says it's contingent upon buyer's assessment of the availability and approval of the cost for any insurance policy desired under this agreement. Now, what this means to you as a buyer's agent is you can't wait until the end of the transaction for your client to line up insurance. Just like with your home inspections and review of seller documents and disclosures, you've got to get the buyer working on lining up homeowners insurance right away as soon as you get under contract, so that the buyer can be satisfied at what it's going to cost them, and the fact that they can actually get it placed, so that when it comes time for the listing agent to say, I need a full contingency removal, buyer will feel comfortable removing this contingency. Let's see here. A couple more things I want to mention. Oh, this one here. For those of you who don't know, beginning January 1st of 2025, there is a new requirement for inspections. And what it's balconies, exterior stairways, and other elevated elements of properties that contain 3 or more dwelling units with elevated balconies. I'm thinking this means condominium buildings, things like that, that have elevated balconies. The state law is going to require that they be inspected before close of escrow. Now, there's a form that CAR is coming out with in June, so you can get a jump on this. It's called the WBSA. It's not actually going to be required for anything other than listings, that are taken from January 1st of 2025 on. So if you take a listing January 1st on, the seller is going to have to provide this within the buyer's inspection period. Now, my feeling is nobody knows how this is going to go yet. My feeling is that if you're dealing with like a condo building or something like that, the HOA management company is going to be securing this inspection on probably a regular basis, and they will provide the ability for the seller to certify this as part of the sale. The reason I suspect that is because, and I'll go into this shortly when we go over the form, but the reason I think this is because the inspection requirements, as outlined in, I think it's the Business and Professions Code, they require some heavy duty inspectors. You can't just use your home inspector to certify this. It has to be an architect or, some other professional at that level, certain licensed contractors, things like that. But we'll go over that in a few minutes. All right. And then last but not least, um, sorry. On the signature page of this new RPA, there's a section that's been added in under the cooperating broker compensation. And so this is the situation where the listing agent has told you ahead of time that they are willing to pay, your buyer's obligation under the BRBC. If the listing agent tells you that, you want to complete a cooperating broker compensation, so the CBC, and my recommendation is you send that to the listing agent before you send your offer over. You can let them know the terms of what you're going to include in the offer in the email where you send this over to them, but send this over along with, send this over ahead of your RPA and other documents. The reason being is if you just send the RPA over there and the seller accepts, you have a ratified contract, and if there's no provision for you to be paid, then that you've already gotten signed, you have no way of getting paid. If you send the the CBC over first, listing agent signs it, then you send the offer over and the seller accepts, you're covered. I think that was it on that form. Now we have the updates that they've done or they're doing to the cooperating broker compensation agreement. The revised form, it's simplified from the previous version. They've removed any references to MLS offers of compensation, and membership with an MLS has been removed. The form should be used to document an agreement between the listing broker and the buyer's broker to avoid confusion about who agreed to pay how much and to whom. So, and there's a nice little section in here, offer regarding compensation. That's where you make sure that you're going to get paid from the listing agent. Also added a mediation and arbitration clause to make it official. You can actually take the listing agent and brokerage through mediation and arbitration yourself. SPBB. So this is the form that I talked about. If you call the listing agent and either he or she says that the seller is willing to pay the buyer broker obligation, or he says the seller isn't willing to pay and the agent's not willing to pay, I say add this form to your RPA. It actually becomes a part of the purchase agreement, right? And this is where you say that the seller is going to be expected to pay a certain percentage of the purchase price or a flat fee out of their proceeds. I figure my logic is, even if the listing agent says the seller is not going to pay, the seller has to present the listing agent has to present all offers to the seller, which means if this comes in the offer, they have to present this as well. If the seller elects to sign the purchase agreement pages, but does not sign this page, it is not a ratified contract. There is no acceptance of your offer. So there's no harm, no foul in sending this along with an offer in order to leave that option open, regardless of what the listing agent tells you. And then the other thing about this form is if they sign this, this becomes part of the contract. And escrow will, ensure that at close of escrow, the seller is paying the buyer broker fee. And then, of course, we have a cancellation of buyer representation form, COBR. This is the most recent modification. There's an optional box, all they did on the modification. So this form is currently out there, but they've added in that both buyer and broker can mutually cancel. Not a huge change, but that was added into it. And previous example or previous version already had stuff about, buyer agrees to pay for out-of-pocket expenses, etc. All that good stuff that was already there. All right. The next prop that I want to go over with you is the changes to the residential listing agreement. So we have the residential listing agreement, which has been gone through a drastic change. The broker compensation advisory. There is now a modification of terms, or MT-LA, for listing agreement. Again, that's replacing the form MT. And we have a disclosure and modification to listing agreement. So we're going to go over those real quickly. First one is the residential listing agreement. And I want to point out that they have modified this to look same type of format as the RPA and as the BRBC. We now have the grids up front. So they're kind of standardizing this type of format, which I've grown to love myself. This form will be bundled with the broker compensation advisory and agency disclosure amongst all the other forms that they've currently been bundling the listing agreement in. They have added in, or they've broken down all the various ways that you can be compensated as a listing agent, which I think is great. There's no room for error here. So compensation to seller's broker, only the seller side of the transaction. Fill in your percentage or your flat fee, whatever you're doing. Optional, you can put it in the listing agreement. That way the listing agent knows up front that they're willing to offer something to pay the buyer broker, so that when you call that listing agent, they will already know that. But if you're taking your listing, you check this box, the seller can fill in the amount that they're willing to pay to the buyer side. Or additional compensation if the buyer is unrepresented. They have one here for if the same agent represents both seller and buyer, dual agency. So anyway, it's a very free-flowing, very easy to complete listing agreement. I love the changes they've made there. Even the stuff like, property will be marketed in the following MLSs where you fill it in, coming soon status, etc. Public marketing to begin on such and such date. Timing and presentation of offers. If you're going to present them as soon as possible or on a specific date. All that good stuff. Anyway, that's that. Detailed dive into the stuff that's on the grid in the first page, explains it further. Seller concessions. Seller concessions are monetary payments that a seller agrees to contribute toward a buyer's expenses and other costs a buyer is responsible for in the transaction. Concessions may include but are not limited to cost of escrow or title, lender fees, repairs, inspections, and they've added in here broker compensation. Concessions identified in an MLS listing must not specify that the concessions are to be used for broker compensation. So listing agents out there, remember that. You cannot put that the seller concessions can be used to pay broker compensation. If you do that, and I'm hoping they'll give you a little bit of a grace period, but if you do that based on MetroList compliance and what, how I have seen them enforce the rules, they're going to hit you with a violation. So just don't do it. Let's see here. Under presentation of offers, additionally, certain buyers may not be able or allowed to pay compensation to a buyer's broker. They're talking about like VA buyers, for example. These buyers may request for the seller to pay buyer's broker through a term or concession request in the purchase agreement or through a separate compensation agreement if seller has not authorized broker in this agreement to pay the full amount that buyer owes to buyer's broker or any amount. Seller is advised to discuss and consider the best strategy for seller related to presentation of offers. I think as kind of we discussed at the very beginning of this, or towards the beginning, lenders are going to have to revisit all of their rules on how they handle this stuff, particularly with regard to VA and FHA buyers. We don't know how that's going to shake out in the future, but as of right now, it potentially is a problem. And that's why they had that admonition there. Showing properties. Seller acknowledges that real estate brokers must have a representation agreement with the buyer before showing properties to that buyer. Seller consents to broker entering into a buyer representation and broker compensation agreement with the buyer, and that by doing so, the brokerage company will become a dual agent representing both buyer and seller. That's important because, as we know, a lot of agents do open houses. Doing an open house, you are now, at least the feeling is you're going to have a buyer broker agreement signed, and there's a few of those forms that we're going to go through here to do that. But in many cases, that will establish dual agency, and so that this is the warning to the seller. Unrepresented buyers. If a buyer is interested in viewing the seller's property is not already represented by a real estate broker, and the buyer refuses to be represented by me or the listing agent, seller authorizes broker to obtain a signed document from the buyer refusing representation by the broker. Broker shall provide such buyers at the earliest practical time a disclosure of non-representation, such as a buyer non-agency. That's the form BNA, or an open house property tour visitor non-agency disclosure, which is the OHNA, which we'll go over. See, I think that's it there. So that's the list. That's the new listing agreement. Broker compensation advisory. We've already gone through this on the buy side, so I don't need to go through this form again. As I said, it can be used for buyers, or will be used for buyers and sellers. Modification of terms for the listing agreement. This is replacing the form MT. This can be used for any changes to the listing agreement. As you can see, it's price, compensation, and it has other expiration date changed, any of that stuff. It's very simple to use. And the DM-LA, disclosure and modification to listing agreement. This form is used to modify the terms in a listing agreement that's in effect before June. So if you take a listing before the new forms release, you want to use this form to modify those terms. It informs the seller that offering compensation through the MLS is now prohibited because of the NAR settlement. Brokers' efforts to offer compensation outside the MLS will satisfy the broker duty to seller. So one of the ways brokers can do that is on their personal websites. They can say, sellers willing to pay, 2.5% to a buyer's agent or something like that. The form should be used prior to the expected July 2024 implementation. There's no need to change or remove commission from the MLS now. This form will cover us once the MLS removes the commission. So if you have a listing that you have now that's going to be, it's not going to be closed before June of 2024 when this new release comes out, get your listing clients to go ahead and sign this form. All right. And then the last group of forms I want to cover are some miscellaneous forms. We've got some related to open houses. We've got the buyer homeowners insurance advisory form, and we've got that wooden balconies form. So first thing, and like I said, these things are changing quickly. What I mean by that, after my fail trying to film this class yesterday morning, I went into my link for the new forms, and they had actually added in this one right here, this OHNA-SI. So I had to, of course, revamp this. But there's 4 forms pertaining to open houses. There's still a bunch of uncertainty as to whether they are actually required at all. We're going under the assumption that you're going to have, if you're holding an open house, you're going to have some documentation for a buyer, a potential buyer, a looky-loo, whatever you want to call them, to come into the house. So this is CAR's solution to that problem. So we'll go through these first 4 really quickly. This first one is called a limited property non-exclusive visitor representation and broker compensation agreement. That's a mouthful, right? Now it says right on the top, for use by an agent holding an open house or another agent giving a prospective purchaser a tour of an open house. So if you're taking a buyer around and they just want to see an open house, you can use this form. Likewise, if you're holding an open house, you can use this form when somebody comes to the door, wants to come in. The thing about this form, if you're taking a buyer around using this, you can only use it for a maximum of 3 properties. The form itself is only available as a non-exclusive buyer representation agreement, and it's only good for a max of 30 days. If you're holding an open house, you can use it for multiple people coming in, but it basically talks about the broker's right to represent visitor. Visitor grants broker, and that's the thing. Everybody coming to the open house in these forms, they're called a visitor. Visitor grants broker the non-exclusive right to represent visitor in acquiring the property. And then it goes into if they're coming here without representation, it tells them you're not required to sign a representation agreement to see the property at open house. If you have already signed a representation agreement with another broker, you should inform the agent holding the open house of the name of the other broker. Wouldn't it be nice if all buyers did that? If at this time you do not want the agent holding the open house to represent you, then you should not sign this form, and you should read and understand an open house non-agency disclosure. We have that form as well. If you've already signed a representation agreement with another broker and you sign this form, you may be obligated to pay 2 different brokers if you purchase this property. Can't be more clear than that. Or they can check this box for visitors touring 1 or more properties with an agent, and it gives them the rules there. Or C, for all visitors, if known and if applicable, visitor has not entered into a representation agreement with another real estate broker and would apply with another real estate broker that would apply to the property. Now, if you're going to represent them, it has a spot to fill in the compensation if they decide to buy the property. And it talks about payments from third parties like the seller, the listing agent, which will be credited against the visitor's obligation to pay you. The next form is the VRBC, Open House Property Tour, Visitor Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. So this was prepared by the Forms Advisory Committee to establish a possible response once more information is known as to whether agents will need a compensation agreement prior to allowing a party to enter and tour an open house. The form is limited to one property only. So you could theoretically bring a stack of these with you to an open house, fill it out ahead of time with the exception of the buyer's name information or contact information, and then go from there. Again, it has the spot to put in your compensation, the offset from third-party payments. And I think this is a pretty simple form to use. And then let's see, is this the last one? Open house visitor non-agency disclosure. There's two of these OHNAs. The first one does not establish an agency. So there is no spot here for you to put compensation. It's just allowing them to view the property. Tells them you don't represent them, et cetera, et cetera. And then last but not least, whoops, that didn't work out right. But this is the new one that was added yesterday. Open house visitor non-agency disclosure and sign-in. So this one is a little bit more detailed than the last. Again, it was prepared by the Forms Committee as a possible response. This form is limited only to a specific open house, does not establish an agency relationship, and does require each visitor to sign in. So this form you could use to cover all visitors. And so if you're not going to be forcing them to sign a buyer representation agreement where they're going to pay you, you would use this form. You could set it out on a table, have everybody sign in on it, and this would cover us, supposedly, in the view of CAR attorneys, in the event that one is recovered. Then we have the moving on out of the open house disclosures, we have the buyer's homeowner's insurance advisory. So this form would be presented to buyers to discuss the problems and the need to obtain homeowner's insurance and to start working on this early on. This is so the buyer is aware of that. This is especially critical now that it's become a contingency that buyer must be able to secure acceptable homeowner's insurance. And then the last form we're going to cover is this wooden balconies and stairs addendum. So this form, as I said, begins January 1st, 2025. Actually, the requirement for the inspections begins then, which will then require the use of this form. You can use the form now if you wanted to, but it covers structures with 3 or more units. So I'm thinking condominium complexes, things like that. But here's the kicker. I wanted to go down here. This is right out of the Health and Safety Code. The inspection shall be formed by a licensed architect, licensed civil or structural engineer, a building contractor holding any or all of the A, B or C-5 license classifications issued by the Contractor State Licensing Board with a minimum of 5 years experience as a holder of the aforementioned classifications or licenses in constructing multi-story wood frame buildings, or an individual certified as a building inspector or building official from a recognized state, national, or international association. So this is not your everyday home inspector that you would come out and have them inspect a property, which is why I am feeling that And given this is going to be mostly, on condo type buildings and structures, that the management company they're going to have to take a proactive approach in getting these inspections completed. Um, because there is currently, to my knowledge, not a market for inspectors of this sort that are going to be available to go out and do these things. So anyway, something to consider for rollout in 2025, but the form I said is going to be available with this June forms release. And I do believe that is all I have to cover here. Make note, once these forms are released, we have final versions. We will need to update our transaction templates within Command. When I say update, we're going to remove for all new escrows, we'll remove the forms like modification of terms, replace them with the buyer and seller specific ones. We'll have to move in some of the new forms related to the BRBC, things like that. Shouldn't be too drastic, but we will need to modify those templates so that we have accurate transactions. Also, if you have any questions about this stuff, feel free to call me or email me, reach out. I'll be happy to answer your questions to the best of my ability. If there's something I can't answer at the moment, I will research it and get back to you. Let's see. And again, familiarize yourselves with the forms, read them before you actually have to use them. I think it'll really help you out in your businesses. So anyway, that's it. And we're going to put an end to this now. Take care. Bye-bye.